selling the books. So it's like there's a book signing, you know, hopefully. So that's just what happens. Publishers just look for the next banner and hang. And then it got shipped here and lost.
I figured I would use both of them as props.
Yeah, amazing. You know what some people do, because this is going out to the Zoom audience, we've done this before for book talks, where we give you one of these.
Oh, leave this one down. This one up.
Perfect. And that's the one you read.
And this is the one I read.
Amazing.
And this is the one I have.
It looks thicker. Is that because, you know, Americans just can't handle that much information? I feel you. Oh, it's a different paper. Okay. there's like a Reader's Digest version for the Americans. Yeah, I totally get it. I know my people. I'll keep an eye. That's why I'm down here. I want to make sure you get the safe and sound on the stage, and we're going to do the rest of it.
Good evening. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is David Brown, and I'm here only to say a very few brief words of welcome on behalf of the Leo Baeck Institute, one of 5 partner organizations here at the Center for Jewish History, this beautiful building that we find ourselves in. The Leo Baeck Institute, of course, is a library and archive focused on the history of German-speaking Jews. And we're very pleased tonight to be hosting a sort of sister institution based in London, the very similar mission, the Wiener Library, the Wiener Holocaust Library, which is a fascinating institution, and you'll hear much more about that in just a moment from our speakers. But I just want to say thank you to Toby and Christine from the Wiener Library for approaching us with this program and helping to organize all the details. Just a couple words of housekeeping. We will, after the discussion, there will be some time for Q&A, so please think of questions. We'll be going up and down the aisles with microphones and passing the mic for you to ask your questions. For those of you joining us online, thank you for being here. Sorry you couldn't be here with us in person. But we'll also try to take a few questions from online as well. And then those of you who are here are also invited to join us afterwards for some wine and soft drinks out in the Great Hall. So, like I said, the Leo Baeck Institute is very pleased to be hosting colleagues from the Wiener Library this evening, and I'm going to hand things over to Toby Simpson, the Executive Director of the Wiener Library, who's here from London, and will tell you some more about his institution and the fascinating program we're going to hear tonight. So, Toby, thanks.
Good evening, everybody. It's such a pleasure to be here from London representing the Wiener Library. I just want to say a huge thanks to David and the Leo Baeck Institute. The Wiener Library has been in London since 1939, which is kind of amazing. And actually, for a long, long period of its history, it was right next door to the Leo Baeck Institute London, actually neighbours, and the staff all knew each other, many of them refugees and survivors themselves, so this is very special for that reason. But I also do want to share with you just a bit more about why this is so special as an occasion for our institution. The Wiener Library is the world's oldest Holocaust archive, which is a very, very special thing. It's been continuously running as an institution for 90 years, since 1933. That's very, very special, and its collections are extensive, varied, profoundly moving, and it's been my absolute privilege to work there for the past decade. Nevertheless, there are some occasions that are extra special, and this is one of them. The library hasn't done an event in the United States, to my knowledge, for about 3 decades, which, so this is really, for us, this is a really big deal. And it's not just because we really want people in America to know how special and important the Wiener Library is. It's also because actually America played a big role in building the Wiener Library. Our founder, Alfred Wiener, actually spent many of the war years in New York. And you'll hear more about that from Alfred Wiener's grandson, Daniel Finkelstein, who is, our main speaker tonight, talking about his book, Two Roads Home. So I am going to keep my comments brief, and I'm going to say that I'm especially delighted that we have a representative from the British Consulate, because the Wiener Library has been recognized now as a designated collection of national significance in Britain, and there are only about 100 special collections that have that title in Britain at all. It's taken a while for Britain to really treasure the library like it deserves to be treasured, and so for us to have a representative from the British Consulate here in New York for such a special occasion is really a wonderful thing. So to open with some comments, I'd like to welcome Rian Matanky-Becker, who is the Chief of Staff to Her Majesty's Trade Commissioner for North America, Rian.
Thank you. And thank you for having me here today. My name is Rian Matanky-Becker, and as mentioned, I'm Chief of Staff at the British Consulate, New York. I'm also one of only 2 Matanky-Beckers in the entire world, but more on that later. Firstly, I want to congratulate Lord Finkelstein on his powerful and important book. It is always important to remember the lessons of the Holocaust, but now reflection is more important than ever. I take 3 lessons from this book. Firstly, this book shows us that there are many ways to suffer, whether that be his mother's tale of surviving Hitler's death camps or his father's suffering in Stalin's slave labor sites. Tragedy is a tale of many faces. The past few weeks, we have witnessed to another unfolding tragedy of many faces. Israel has suffered the worst terrorist attack in its history, and Palestinian civilians are experiencing devastating and growing humanitarian crisis. I hope that the current ceasefire is the first step on the road to a political solution that provides justice and security for both Israelis and Palestinians. A second important lesson of this book, and indeed of the fantastic Wiener Library, is the role of propaganda and disinformation and how challenging it is to fight those narratives, and how important it is to do so and to document them. We have seen across the world a recent rise in hate crime, especially attacks fueled by anti-Semitism. We must not accept this. The fight against hate will not happen by itself. This is especially challenging in our online world, and when even the truth is contested, we must treasure institutions like the Wiener Library. The third lesson from this book is that it shows us a different future is possible. Lord Finkelstein himself is testimony to that. Born to Holocaust survivors who faced incredible persecution, he is now a leading figure in politics and journalism. Embedded in his very story, there is a seed of hope for all of us. And so I return to where I began, who I am. The Chief of Staff at the British Consulate, which means I work to promote UK-US cooperation to be a global force for good. But I am more than my job. I am the product of my own personal history. My name is Matanky-Becker. Matanky is Eastern European, the name of my Jewish family who were forced to flee persecution in the USSR and seek refuge here in the United States. Becker is German, the name of my grandfather who was a soldier in Hitler's army and who invaded and occupied the British Channel Islands before being taken prisoner of war and ultimately given his freedom and a life in the UK. So I stand here with both of these roads home in my personal narrative, a narrative of persecuted, of occupier, of refugee, of rehabilitation, of freedom, both here in the United States and the UK. I stand here as the daughter of this history, as Chief of Staff at the Consulate, and as a keen student of this wonderful book, hoping that long may the US and the UK be the beacons of freedom in many people's personal histories, as they have been in mine. So thank you to everyone here and to everyone involved in organising.
Thank you for those words. We were supposed now to hear from Sarah Wildman, a New York Times correspondent, and we're very sorry to say that she was unable to attend this evening, and she sends her sincere apologies. And so I will now take on the role of introducing the next segment. And this is the main segment. We are now going to hear about Daniel Finkelstein's moving, gripping, wonderful book, Two Roads Home. And yes, Daniel has been an amazing supporter to the library, a friend, a wise counsel to us, and so for me personally it's a privilege to introduce him. And one of the things that's really changed for us as an institution is, for the first time, people can walk into a Barnes & Noble, or in the UK this is kind of like Waterstones or these big bookshops, and they can pick up and learn about the history of the library. This has never been the case. And already people come in and say, oh, I came here because I read this book. So Daniel Finkelstein, the grandson of Alfred Wiener, who founded the Wiener Library, he is, of course, very well known for his political work, especially as a columnist at the Times of London newspaper, and was a former advisor to prime ministers. and of course is also a member of the House of Lords. Today, he will be in conversation with another great friend of the library, Professor Debórah Dwork, who has been the judge of our special Frankel Prize, which we award to young, also historians who have achieved great things with their recent works, and we thank her for that. She's the director of the Center for the Study of the Holocaust, Genocide, and Crimes Against Humanity at the Graduate Center, City University of New York. She is, of course, renowned for her scholarship on Holocaust history. Her path-breaking early oral recording of Holocaust survivors, which weaved their narratives into her history, has contributed to her amazing reputation and highly deserved reputation. Her award-winning books include Flight from the Reich, Auschwitz, the Holocaust, and Children with a Star. Debórah Dwork has also been the recipient of the International Network of Genocide Scholars Lifetime Achievement Award and the Annetje Vels Kupferschmidt Award, which was bestowed by the Dutch Auschwitz Committee. And Debórah will be leading Daniel Finkelstein in conversation for the next 50 minutes. So I'd like to invite both Professor Debórah Dwork and Lord Daniel Finkelstein to the stage.
Up?
I hope so. I think I am.
That's wonderful. Reading glasses. So I have a million questions, as you can see from this endless list. And therefore, I will try to remain true to the list and not go on tangent after tangent after tangent. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes, everyone can hear you.
I am mic'd.
Yeah. I think they can hear you.
Great. So let's start with the most obvious question. What inspired you to write this family memoir? And what was the final trigger?
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Toby, for that introduction, and thank you to the Wiener Library for organising this. It's wonderful to be here. As you say, New York plays a big role in my family story, so it's a wonderful place to be able to introduce this book. I think I've always known that I had to write this book, even at a time when I wasn't much of a reader and I wasn't much of a writer. I still understood that there was a property to this story that needed a teller, and in the family that would be me. But why did I write it now? I'll give you two answers, one of which is a crudely pragmatic one and will interest anyone with an interest in journalism or getting projects done. I got an agent, okay? So I was working with Prime Minister David Cameron on his memoirs, and I got an agent to help me with the negotiation with him over doing his book. And then when that was done, I felt a bit embarrassed to be going to dinner parties and saying I have an agent when I wasn't giving this agent any work. So I began to talk to him about what I should do. And of course, I suddenly realized that my great desire that one day I would write a book and my great desire that I would tell this story were not actually two different things, but one and the same thing. I therefore set about doing it, and that was the most difficult thing, finding the time, making sure to do it. So that was the kind of pragmatic answer. But there's also another answer, which is, at my 50th, and I tell this in the book, at my 50th birthday, I spoke about how my children would not be sent to fight in a faraway war, that I didn't live in fear of a knock on the door, from some state authority coming to arrest me, that the things that had happened to my parents weren't going to happen to my children. And I realized that when I'd reached 60 years old, I wouldn't have made the same speech. It's not that I thought for certain that something terrible like that would happen. but more that dismissing it complacently now no longer seemed appropriate. And I realized that for that reason it was time to do this book.
And that was the trigger.
That was the trigger.
So please tell us about the research process, or as I call it, search and research.
Yes. Well, there were really two aspects to the content of the book. The first is to establish a historical framework. So I'm telling two stories. The first is what the Nazis did to my to my mother and to my maternal grandparents and to my mother's sisters. And the other is what Stalin did to my father. And I needed to establish the links between those stories and the main aspects of them. So although I, for example, knew that my mother had been in Belsen, I didn't really understand what that was. I knew a little bit about it from my mother's telling me what it was. I understood that it wasn't an extermination camp, but at the other hand that many people had died there, but I didn't understand what it was. So part of the research was researching what was the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, what were the gulags, what was Stalin trying to do by arresting so many people, and the history of the Wiener Library, which I knew I was going to have to tell as well. So part of it was about that. But then there was a second aspect to the research, which was finding out the specifics of my family's story, because I wanted it to be very personal. I didn't want the reader to go through even 2 or 3 pages without feeling they were connected to what was happening in this narrative to my family. So that involved going through boxes and boxes of family papers. I would say this: if you want to write a family history, my first piece of advice to you is have a grandfather who's one of the great archivists of the 20th century. And this really helped. There were so many papers there. So just to give one small example, my Aunt Ruth, my mother's eldest sister, had kept a number of documents which she'd perceived were important before her arrest. She'd given them to a Dutch friend, a Dutch non-Jewish friend, who'd kept these papers and given them back to her. And they included all of the games that she used to play in Holland, and some newsletters from the little club that they set up. It included her autograph books from when she was a small child. So there were boxes and boxes of papers like that, and I realized I had to go through every single one. And I realized that on the first piece of paper that I opened, which was my grandfather's British passport. Okay, it was a very banal document. You get the new passport, you get the old one back with the corner cut off, and you put it away. Apparently that has little to offer, except for the fact that it told me that my grandfather was 5'7". And I knew that my grandmother was nearly 6 foot. So it was important in establishing a picture of the sort of couple that they were, so you could get a visual picture of that. But I realized at the moment of finding that out, that every single document on every single line would contain a piece of descriptive detail like that. So the moment I found that, I was both exhilarated because it was a piece of information I could use, and I was daunted because I realized how much work there was ahead.
So I would like to follow up on this question. It's a more theoretical issue, and that is, what do we really know about our family's history, and when do we learn it, and how do we learn it? So you've talked about the process of going through the boxes and the pleasure and treasure of having a father and a grandfather who saved documents, but I'm talking about even before that.
So I've been very lucky. My parents both talked about their experience to me, to lots of Holocaust survivors. And I remember going actually to a couple of meetings at the Wiener Library with people who were the children of Holocaust survivors. And the idea was it was the second generation. My mother never liked that idea, actually, because she felt that she had been through this experience, so I didn't have to, and she never liked me to think of myself as being a second generation Holocaust survivor. But that was the idea of it, and I realized lots of people, their parents, they either had the experience that their parents were silent on the subject, or they no longer had their parents and they hadn't asked these critical questions. So I was always very fortunate. Both my parents talked a lot about it, but there were two levels of misunderstandings or sort of lack of understandings. The first was, I was quite young when they told me these stories. I had gone back to them later as a journalist when they were, and I'd asked some questions, but there were questions I didn't think to ask and therefore didn't know. And the other, which was even more interesting, is there were lots of things my parents didn't know about their own experience. So my mother, for example, I don't think she was the subject of an exchange towards the end of the war, which saved her life. Only 136 people were in this exchange, and she had a Paraguayan passport that had been falsely issued. It wasn't forgery, but it was falsely issued. I don't think my mother knew the story of that. There's another part of the book where I write about the extraordinary escapades of their home help, Betty, whom we knew very well. She became Betty from Nottingham, a friend of ours, and her story is absolutely amazing. I don't think my mother appreciated that she was part of the resistance. And that piece of information made a lot of sense in the story. But just to give you a tiny example of something that when I researched the book, I discovered and I'd never known. When my father is arrested by the Soviets, they are in a cattle truck in Lvov goods station. And my great-grandmother, Charlotta, is in this, and is in this cattle truck, and she bangs on the train door and is eventually allowed to get out to go to the toilet, to the bathroom, as you would say in New York. And she goes, and the story I was told was she went into this bathroom, dropped her fur coat on the floor, and walked out. Okay? So that story had never made much sense to me, what they couldn't recognise her when she came out. Why were dropping the fur coat on the floor? And it was only when I was researching the book and I listened very carefully to my father giving his witness testimony, he said she walked into the toilet, dropped her fur coat on the floor, gave the guard her gold watch and walked out. Now that made sense. So there were lots of holes in this story that I filled in as I did it. And I really wanted this. So I think there were lots of stories about the Second World War where people don't know really what happens. And I wanted this to be different. I felt with the advantage of Alfred's library and my father's amazing recall and the witness statements he'd left and all the correspondence I had a chance to tell a very complete story, to really give you an intimate view of what happened to these people at all points. And that put a big challenge. It meant I had to fill all the little holes. So I couldn't be perplexed by something like my grandmother walking out, having dropped a coat on the floor. So there were a few things through the book that worried me, but I did track I think I tracked all of them down in the end.
Good for you. Few authors can say that. They write what they write and they just hope that the audience doesn't notice, is my experience. So let's delve into the story itself.
Sure.
Your father's family suffered under the Soviets. Your mother's family suffered under the Nazis. Can you talk about those two separate trajectories?
Yes. So first of all, though they are completely separate, the Nazis and the Soviets were engaged in a similar project. The way that I look at it is they both thought their countries had been, and the world was being diverted by a pernicious, secretive elite. And they alone understood the real spirit of the nation, which was either the spirit of the ethnic group they belonged to or the spirit of the working class. And what they were going to do was remove this pernicious elite, which included, my father and mother when they were 10 years old. So the Nazis set about arresting all the Jews, some of whom were shopkeepers, and the Soviets set about arresting all the shopkeepers, some of whom were Jews. But it was a similar project. And during a part of this book, and certainly a very important incident, they actually allied in doing this. So when everyone compares, who committed which crime, it's important to understand that Stalin and Hitler were guilty of some of the same crimes. Certainly the one that affected my father. My father was born in Lvov, what's now Lviv, in 1929. His father was a wealthy iron and steel merchant, and sufficiently wealthy that he was known as the Iron King. So that gives you an idea of the sort of scale of his enterprise. He owned steel mills and factories, and was a city councillor and a big donor in the Jewish community. And when the Soviets take over their part of Poland, they are equally bent as the Nazis were on destroying the Polish elite and the Polish government. They integrate Poland into Soviet Ukraine, and they arrest everybody who has the slightest connection with any kind of power or any international influence, by which I mean if you were a philatelist, you would get arrested. If you were an Esperanto speaker, you'd be arrested. If you were a head teacher, you'd be arrested. And arrest meant, in my grandfather's case, being accused of strengthening the might of capitalist Poland, which he was certainly guilty of, and being an antisocial element. And he is, for being an antisocial element under the Ukraine Penal Code, he's sentenced to 8 years in the Gulag, which at his age, he was 50, is really a death sentence. And this involved him being sent for 3 weeks in a cattle truck to the Gulag in Ukhta Chiburi, where he was put to work pulling logs from the forest to the river. Fortunately, he was literate and he could count, and this meant that he ended up getting a desk job, which was absolutely critical. But effectively, otherwise you died because the food ration was always too small to allow you to do the work that you were allocated. At the same time, by the point that my father is arrested, because my father was then sent to a state collective farm, they arrested all the families of these people and sent them thousands of kilometers away, and he was put to work in a state collective farm. They stayed in this small, they had to make themselves a shack out of cow dung, and they had no heating, so it was completely freezing. It was below freezing inside during the winter, and they weren't really able to cook anything. They had hardly any food, but fortunately they were able to receive food parcels because they weren't actually strictly speaking criminals. They'd just been deported there. And so they were able to survive at least one winter during that. At the same time, the Nazis have invaded Holland. My grandfather, Alfred Wiener, was one of the first people to understand the rise of the far right in Germany. So in 1919, he comes back from the First World War. He writes a tract that says, if we do nothing, we will talk to our relatives, to our descendants of bestial murder. And you can imagine the impact to me. I've got there are descendants of Alfred in the audience, and I am now here talking to them about bestial murder, just as he predicted would happen. And so Alfred began an archive. This was the first iteration, actually, of the Wiener Library. He begins to collect everything the Nazis say, all their leaflets, all their newspapers. Years and years later, when Mengele, the doctor of death from Auschwitz, is supposed to be in Argentina, nobody knows whether it's really him. The only person in the world who had a picture of Mengele was Alfred and the Wiener Library. So in 1933, the Nazis come to power. Goering decides that to call in the leadership of the Jewish community. He has a confrontation with Alfred. He tells him he knows about this archive and that it has to be destroyed. And ultimately they do have to do that, and they begin again in Amsterdam, and that's what we now have in London as the Wiener Library begins then. And in the 1930s, my mother's born in 1933, and they build up the Wiener Library. They use it in trials, for example, in Switzerland, where they fight the publishers of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And by 1940, Alfred has taken this library to London to help the war effort there, and then some of it to New York, where he helps the State Department and the Foreign Office and the publicity effort to ensure that the war aims are understood and what the Nazis are doing is what more widely understood. But while he does that, my mother is captive as a result of the Nazis invading Holland.
Your grandfathers were remarkable men, but so were your grandmothers. So would you please talk to us a little bit about how these women managed the agency that they exhibited, separated from their husbands, taking care of their children, protecting them? I don't mean to lead the witness.
No. So you're quite right. I think that in many ways, Two Roads Home is a story of two incredible women, my grandmothers. And so it's important to understand the sort of people they were in order to understand their experiences. But my paternal grandmother, whom I knew as Granny, she was a person of amazing sort of toughness and resilience. Even when I knew her, I remember once I was doing political canvassing in the roads around her house, and one of the canvassers came to me and said that they'd met a woman who wasn't going to vote for our candidate because of her stupid hairstyle, and I knew it was Granny immediately, as indeed it was. But she was, they were very wealthy. They had a cook and a gardener and a chauffeur, and she played, she went and had coffee evenings with people. She had bridge evenings too, although she thought bridge was a stupid game, and so she was a terrible partner. But she had this inner toughness that went along with this incredible, privileged life, and she was also very educated. And when my father and her are sent to this state collective farm, she is determined that what she has seen happen to so many children on the way to this farm, which is, almost every stop, the train stops, they had to leave bodies by the side of the road as they went, by the side of the railway, as they went on to this state collective farm. She was determined that would not happen to my father. She builds this shack out of cow dung because the cows needed the stable back where she had been originally staying. And she, every day she would go out of this shack, crawl out, and then make her way to the river to get water for the families that were with her. And she would fight her way back through this blizzard and then come in and sit by my father's bunk, well, he was on a sort of wicker basket, and teach him languages, Schiller, the Iliad and the Odyssey. She was determined that his mind would not wither away, even if his body was going to. And she does see him, she does see him to survival and freedom. And I always remember she was very defiant in this state collective farm. And I remember she was in our house, she was doing the ironing of my father's shirts in our house, and saying to me that the commissar on the farm had said to her, one day your son will be a great Soviet leader and you will be ironing his shirts. And so there she was ironing. He didn't become a big Soviet leader though. So that was my paternal grandmother. My maternal grandmother, Alfred's wife, Greta, had been one of the very few women to have a PhD. She had a PhD in economics in the 1920s. One of the most amazing revelations that, to me in this book, was that somebody had read her PhD and told me what it was about, because it's 300 pages long and I couldn't translate the whole thing, so I didn't quite know how to tackle it. But this woman had an interest in my story and had read the PhD, and it turns out my grandmother's interest was in the difference between utopian free marketeers and people with a practical interest in free market economics. This is so close to my own intellectual and political interests as to be completely uncanny, and I knew nothing about it, so that was an extraordinary thing to discover. But she has to make all the difficult decisions when Alfred is in London and they are cut off from him. They have no money, And so she ends up, for example, having to sell my grandfather's stamp collection. In fact, when I was young, my mum wanted me to collect stamps. She often suggested it to me, and it was something that never interested me, even though I got the collecting gene. I've ended up collecting letters by prime ministers rather than stamps. But she wanted me to collect stamps, and it was only when I did this book I suddenly thought, oh, that was why she was wanting me to do this stamp collecting. I didn't really, I just felt a bit bad about it. But
Wait a second. Do you think she wanted you to collect stamps because her father had, or do you think it was her form of money? If you have stamps.
Oh, no, it was because it was a sort of restoration, I'm pretty sure. She never was as explicit as that, but I'm pretty sure that it was, because it was something that Alfred loved, and then we'd lost this collection, and she sort of maybe thought it would be a good idea. She never put it like that, and I didn't know. It was only when I was doing the book that it suddenly occurred to me that must have been the reason, because I always thought it was a bit odd. I showed no interest in stamps. Woody Allen always called it cancelled mail, and I kind of don't think that's what it is. But some people are very interested, and Alfred clearly was. But the points I'm making here is she had these very difficult decisions to make all the time. Much, much more difficult. She's offered a chance to hide my mother. So somebody says they will take my mother. They can't take the whole family. There was nowhere to put them, but they would be willing to hide my mother was the youngest. And my grandmother has to decide whether to do that or not. And she ultimately decides against it, and it's very difficult to know whether she was right or wrong, because obviously my mother did survive. She was just worried about them being caught, and also she was worried about them being separated and how my mother would fare. And it's hard to know. But she has to take all these decisions, and ultimately she has to battle for them to remain off these transportations to Auschwitz and Sobibor. When they're in Westerbork, which is the camp to which all Dutch Jews are sent, it becomes apparent that certain documentation will act as an exemption that would mean that you would not be sent on immediately to the gas chambers. And without that exemption, my great-aunt Trudy, Greta's very dear sister, and my great-uncle Jan and my mother's first cousin Fritz are sent to Sobibor within only a few weeks of arrival in Westerbork. But Greta has a series of documents, one of which was a Palestine certificate, and ultimately the one that saves them, which is this Paraguayan passport, each of which she has to kind of barter with people to keep them off the transports. And I know that because my aunt kept a diary, which is in the Wiener Library, and it includes several occasions on which they are listed to be on these transports, but then they don't go. And that Greta fought for.
Would you please tell the audience a little more about the exchange?
Yes.
The transport she was on.
I've mentioned these Paraguayan passports, so I better explain them. And it's something that I didn't understand. I remember that telling my grandmother's story one year, because I've often done it on social media, each day of their exchange I would write about it when it comes up annually. And somebody said to me, did these Paraguayan passports come from Bern? Well, that's the only thing that I knew about it. They came from Switzerland, and I didn't really understand why. My mother certainly didn't either. She never explained. It turned out that in Switzerland, in the Polish embassy, the Polish government in exile being one of the organizations in the world that understood best what was happening to the Jews, the ambassadorial staff had been buying blank passports from a man who was a Swiss notary who was employed by Paraguay to be their consul, their honorary consul in Switzerland. And he was engaged in a money-making racket which involved him selling these blank passports and then stamping whatever he was given back. And these Polish diplomats created probably several hundred of these passports. And for various reasons, which I won't spoil because I don't want to reveal what's in the book, my family ended up with one of these passports. And the reason why that was important was that instead of being on one of these transports to Auschwitz or to Sobibor, they were sent to Belsen. And what Belsen was, I said before, I didn't understand what it was. What it was a camp established, or this main part of it anyway, was a camp established by Himmler to hold Jews who had hostage value. Right? So they could be swapped for tanks or money, or, as in this case, people who were German citizens who happened to live in some of these in Allied occupied countries. And Himmler imagines there'll be tens of thousands of these people who will be swapped. Ultimately, hardly anybody is. But there is one swap, which ultimately involved 136 people, which used the Paraguayan passports. And my mother, my grandmother, and my mother's two sisters are on this one journey, and it's the reason why we've used the term miraculous on the front of the book, because it certainly was miraculous to be one of only 136 people involved in such an exchange. And so they were American citizens who were interned, who were involved in this exchange, and there were 136 Jews. Most of those Jews ended up going to Algeria, but Alfred had spent the war mainly in the Century Hotel in Midtown, and had been working with various people, including a man called David Bowes-Lyon, who was the Queen's brother. Isaiah Berlin was involved in this effort as well. And they had created, they were working on the kind of propaganda effort in the West, buying foreign newspapers, creating items for, leaflet drops that the Air Force did to German countries and things like that. And Alfred managed to get my mother and her sisters on a boat called the Gripsholm, which came in to New York, coming into the Statue of Liberty. And I've come in this week, actually, with my newspaper, The Times, on a ship. So I came in the same way. I woke up early to watch what my mother saw from the deck of the Gripsholm to see the Statue of Liberty as it emerges. And it's very touching to read, because they had both wrote about it almost immediately after it happened, that the effect you would imagine the Statue of Liberty had on such people, it did have. In other words, that they saw that they were coming home to the land of the free. And they both reflected on that. It's very moving and, I think quite significant for US citizens.
It is significant, absolutely. Let's pick up on this word miraculous. As it happens, I am particularly interested in the role of the unpredictable. Luck, timing, fortuitous circumstance, chance, and also in the irrational. We always think that things happened for a reason, that people had perfectly rational reasons for why they behaved as they did, but in fact, sometimes they did it just because they did it. They wanted to do it. It appealed to their sense of adventure or their emotions. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the role of the unpredictable and or the irrational in your family's history.
Yeah. So one of the interesting questions in the family has always been this. Alfred goes to London in 1938-9. What happens is that Kristallnacht happens in Germany. People are trying to leave. My grandfather begins a collection of, together with his staff in the what's called at that point the Jewish Central Information Office, begin a collection of the eyewitness statements, and for the first time, a bit carelessly, they use the imprint of the library and its address in the publication of this information. And the Dutch government becomes very concerned that it's undermining their neutrality. And this is the reason why he goes to London, but he does not bring the family with him. So obviously, if he had brought the family with him, there would have been no story of Belsen and of the Paraguayan passports. He would have had the family with him the whole time. And I've found correspondence between Alfred and Greta, which explains why they did this. It was because they thought that Holland was safe. There was indeed an exchange that a woman called Gertrude van Toyn, who was very much involved with Dutch Jews and for whom Greta had worked, she believed very strongly that Holland would remain neutral, and she told Chaim Weizmann that only about a week before, I think, the decision that Alfred and Greta made. So clearly it was all part of the same discussions they were all having. They thought Holland would remain neutral, so they stayed in Holland. It seemed to them safer in Holland than in London, and you can see why. But of course that was a miscalculation. So often people say to me things like, my relatives were prescient, they got out. And nobody could be more prescient than Alfred and Greta. I mean, Alfred had understood what the Nazis were doing in 1919. It's just that he perfectly reasonably didn't think that they would invade Holland at that point. So I think there are lots of moments in the story where we use hindsight to establish what could have happened. In one of the bits with which I begin my father's story, they built a beautiful house on a hill in Lvov. It still stands, actually, a marvellous Art Deco house. And I think they thought they were going to be in there for hundreds of years, and the family was there for a year. Now it belongs to some restaurateur. Again, probably there are lots of people who'll read my book who won't know, even while they're reading it 80 years later, what's going to happen to people who were in the Soviet zone. So they could be forgiven for not having appreciated it before it happened. And there are lots of bits in the book where we because we know what's going to happen, we as readers know what's going to happen. We assume that the people who were in the story knew what was going to happen, but of course they didn't.
Still, your grandfather, Alfred, remains a mystery to me. Does he remain a mystery to you?
There are bits of him. He's a very singular individual. And there are lots of bits of that. I mean, even before any of this happens, he is... somebody used a phrase about him, the waste paper bin was a stranger to him. So he has this incredible interest in books. Everywhere in his house is covered in books. He was also a total workaholic. And this becomes clear, So he's spending many nights at big public meetings, which are often disrupted by SS or what turned out to be future members of the SS, but by Nazi thugs. He spends a lot of time in Switzerland suing these publishers of Protocols of the Elders of Zion, while Greta is at home with the children. But more strikingly, at the end of the war, when the children arrive in New York and he is alone to greet them, he then goes back to London to save the library, and they end up staying in New York for a further 2 years without him. And you can read that and you think to yourself, he certainly was a very driven person with a great belief in his work, and we're all beneficiaries of that. The thing I can say is that if anybody... my Uncle Ted, who was Eva's, my mother's middle sister's husband, he was still alive while I was researching the book, and I talked to him a couple of times. And once I talked to him about this particular thing, that Alfred had gone back to London, and he said that it had been something that bothered him. And I said, did it bother Eva? And he said, no, if I ever said anything about that to Eva or to your mother, they'd be furious with me. And so they were never critical of Alfred. They understood, they loved him without condition, really, and they understood exactly what he was doing. But that he was a singular individual, very focused on his work above everything else, and his mission, that's obvious from the story.
Your aunt and your mother may see their father in a particular way, but that doesn't say how you see him. You are a father.
Yeah, but I am a father, but I'm not subject to the same pressures as he was. Who's to know what I would have done? And I tell you the other thing I think that's a very important part of the book about judgments about people So there's a story early when the Nazis invade Holland. The first thing that Greta does is she takes the nameplate off the door. She thinks that the Nazis are going to come straight to the library, which most of the books have already moved, but there was still enough paper to convict them all. So they start burning things. Right? And on the desk of one of the people who worked in the library, they discover these, there were visas that Alfred had arranged for library staff to come to London. And these visas had been kept on the desk because the person who'd received them didn't want the library to leave. Clearly an error, okay, but on his part. And this man dies in Belsen himself, and various other members of the library staff die. Was that the fault of the people who made that judgment? You know, was he to blame for their deaths? And my mother was always very clear: it was the Nazis who were to blame. Mm-hmm. So my mother's feeling, and I think it's actually mine too, a little bit out of filial solidarity, but also because I suppose her DNA is in me as well. You know, her genes are in me. Her view is the Nazis were to blame, and everyone reacted in completely impossible circumstances the best way they could. So to give this example, Alfred was right. She couldn't bring the girls to London because he had nowhere for them, and he had no transport for them, and he couldn't look after them. My mother always used to say he couldn't boil an egg, which is true. So he couldn't look after them. And if he had not gone back to London, the library would have been broken up. He would not have had an income being able to do it. And all of his work, the work that's so precious and valuable now, that's such a service to history, that that many of us are still, working always hard to defend and to promote, that would have all gone. Would that have been the right decision? Who knows? So I'm prepared simply to admire how they all cope with this impossible situation. And since it doesn't appear to have undermined his relationship with his daughters, maybe it was right.
And there's a difference between judgment and understanding.
Sure, I completely see why he took the decision. It's just a question of whether it, I just think it was very hard.
Yes.
I think it was very hard. But they were in very hard circumstances. My father's father never recovers himself really after the Gulag. I think that if he died there on the spot, it couldn't have been more certain the contribution he made to his death, and he never recovers his fortune or his footing really. That was the fault of Stalin. It wasn't his fault.
No, not at all. He never recovered his health even.
No, exactly, which is not surprising.
No. So I have only 2 more questions before I turn you to the mercy of the audience. The first is, I am the niece of a Holocaust survivor, and as I grew up, I loved her very much. And as I grew up, there were certain things that she said, certain lessons she wished to impart to me about what I should do or shouldn't do in life. One of the reasons why I asked you, for example, about the stamps, whether the stamps meant money, currency, is because my aunt, who was a jeweler, said, never mind about specie. It's not going to get you anywhere, but a diamond will get you a piece of bread. And I'm wondering whether from either your mother's side or your father's side, there were lessons that they wanted to impart, or insights.
None like that, actually. And it's interesting when you said to me about the stamp album and the money, that never occurred to me, and I don't think it would have occurred to her either. So none like that, but there were certain things. So my father was very keen that we should always obey the law. He believed very strongly in the rule of law. That was incredibly important to him. he always felt if I was going to be involved in politics, there would be no point spending all that time trying to persuade people the law should be this or the law should be that if you didn't care whether you obeyed the law or not. So he regarded that as very important. They were very keen on a sense of proportion and a lot of understanding of other people and their dilemmas and difficulties and quirks. Whether or not that would have been the case anyway, whether that was just part of their personality, I don't know. But but they never would quit the synagogue committee in a furious row about the education syllabus, or have a massive row with the neighbours about the hedge, or disapprove of their children's partners. They felt very strongly about sort of a sense of proportion and about being kind of kind and understanding to other people, which definitely did arise from it. The only direct thing is I do remember my mother once being really cross with me for describing myself as starving before some meal. That was quite a striking thing, but it was very rare, and she was very keen that we would live and not just survive. And there was an amazing moment when Ronald Reagan, I don't know if you remember this here, but Ronald Reagan went to Bitburg and a state visit, which involved a visit to a cemetery in which there were SS graves. And this turned into a big crisis for him because they hadn't advanced that and they didn't know that was what's going to happen. So then it's decided he was going to go to Belsen as well. So I hear this on the radio, I'm upstairs, I come downstairs at home, my mother's washing up, I'm standing behind her, and I said, oh, Mum, Ronald Reagan's going to go to Belsen. And without turning around, Mum said, so what, I've been. and I think they both wanted us to understand this story that they had experienced. They didn't hide the fact that it had been very difficult for them, but they didn't want it to be oppressive to us. And that was very important to them, I think.
So I have asked my questions of you, and you might be wondering, did this woman really read my book? She omitted the most important thing. So I wonder, what have I not asked that I should have asked?
No, I think you've asked all the right things, and it's interesting that you picked up, because a lot of people, I think, will pick up on this question of Alfred's relationship. Lots of people, one thing that a lot of people have asked me is, who was worse, Stalin or Hitler? That was one of the things. And indeed, I did contemplate, as Chris knows, the title, and discuss this with Doubleday, my wonderful publisher, as well, the question of whether I should have, it's not a competition. That was my mother's statement, and I thought of it as the title of this book. And I do hope that people will, without engaging in a kind of decisions who was worse, will see the correspondence between these crimes. Among Alfred's papers, just after the passport, I pulled out a file, and my grandfather had got his personal copy of the indictment of the Nuremberg conspirators. When I read through it, partly because I was working on Alfred's story, I suddenly realized that everything that the Nazis were found guilty of, the Soviets had also committed. That all of these crimes, in their own different ways, the Soviets had also committed them. And we understand little of that history. And so I hope this book, by putting these stories alongside each other, will help people to understand the differences. There were no, the kind of the horrific mechanized nature of the Nazi Holocaust doesn't have its correspondence in what the Soviets did, but people will still be able to see what the Soviets did do as a horrific crime itself.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you so very much.
Thank you both. I'd now like to invite questions from the audience. And yes, we have a question at the front.
Good evening, Lord Finkelstein. I too am the daughter of survivors. As the ultimate political insider the ultimate publishing and media insider, as the descendant of Holocaust survivors, and as the ultimate Jewish insider, what, in your opinion, in today's Great Britain, how would you assess the Jewish question vis-a-vis Jeremy Corbyn and his ilk, the Muslims, who the largest Muslim population in Europe lives in the UK, and also in view of many years ago the trial of the Holocaust denier and Professor Lipstad's trial. How would do you think that there's any hope, or should we all just go to Israel now?
By the way, let me start with your finishing point. This question of whether the right thing to do for Jews to be safe is to go to Israel is quite similar in ilk to the question that Alfred and Greta faced when they were deciding whether it was better to be in Holland or London. Who knows the answer to that question? But I would tell you this, that reading Alfred's 1919 tract towards pogroms, you can see seeds of that in all sorts of places. Unfortunately here and also in London, the rise of conspiracy theories, violence against Jews, defacing of Jewish signs, and which the Wiener Library has also suffered. And Tobin made the most brilliant decision to take the sign down and put it into the collection of the Wiener Library as an example of anti-Semitism, which I thought was a genius response. All of those things, you can see those seeds. But at the same time, when you read that pamphlet, you realise that all of those things were much worse in Germany in 1919 than they are in either the United States or Britain. So it can increase your alertness, but you must also rely on your sense of proportion. We have to be able to live, and we need to live without fear, but we shouldn't live stupidly and not understand the kind of the threats that exist. And I think it was very, very important to my parents, the sense of proportion. And they didn't want to see Hitler and Stalin in everything. They could see the difference between Hitler and Stalin and their own experiences. And that's important, to being able to live our lives as free citizens and without fear, and boldly, and assert our Jewishness. But at the same time, you don't want to be dumb, and you have to see the things that are happening and to accept that they happen. By the way, underneath all the things that happen in my book, the economic system failed, and that is very important. It ceased. People were searching for an alternative because the First World War had been so calamitous that the civilizations and democracies and economies of the Western world were under threat. And these somewhat, these wild ideologies, communism and fascism, were part of answering the failures of capitalism. So one of the things that we can do to keep ourselves safe and free is to ensure that the economic system we have delivers for everyone.
Yes, a question here. Thank you very much.
Thank you for a fascinating conversation. I have a question, not so much about the family, but about Alfred Wiener's colleagues. And I'm thinking specifically of the Zentralverein. And I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about some of the people whom he worked with and whom he was inspired by, or who he inspired, because I know this is not just a one-man deal.
Absolutely.
So I'd be grateful.
Sure, of course. So first of all, to understand, the Zentralverein that's being referred to is the Central Association of Germans of Jewish Faith. And it's the main communal body that spans the whole community in terms of both politics and of politics and religious faith. So, it does have. There are some people who are sort of outside this movement. So it was non-Zionist. They wanted to create the future in Germany, and and it wasn't communist. So after the war, there were quite a lot of critics of the Zentralverein who criticised it for being, for not seeing the failings of the German political system as being the origins of fascism. Right? The communists obviously saw capitalism as the origin of fascism. So he is one of the leaders of this organisation, and there are a number of people that I mentioned in that, including Ludwig Hollander, whom he works with, and there are disputes among some of these people. So Alfred was very committed to the idea of using absolute truth, and other people like Walter Gisling and Ludwig Hollander were a bit more interested in being more propagandistic and who can tell whether they were correct. So there are all sorts of little rows, and some of those come out in the book. My son, who helped me copy edit, was very keen that it didn't turn into simply a biography of Alfred, which has been done brilliantly by Ben Barkoff in a book on the making of the Wiener Library, so I didn't need to repeat that. The group then forms the Jewish Central Information Office. I do write a bit about this. His colleague, Mr. Arensfeld, did a sort of tract on what the library was like. It was sort of somewhat eccentric group of people with different backgrounds, all of whom crowded into this sort of small office, which was full of cigarette smoke and paper, which was a bit of a... it sounded like a complete fire trap, actually, when you read about it. But Alfred was, you say we did it with other people, that is true, but he was very much the boss, and I think a bit domineering in that respect. So at one point, I think, when they're discussing the financing of the library, the people in the United States think that they're doing the library staff a favour if they can keep Alfred in America, so that the people who are running the library in London don't have to put up with him running everything. So I think he was a bit of a micromanager.
It's also interesting, I think, that he inspired so many of the people that he worked with. So there's an amazing story about Louis Bondy, who ran the library actually during the war. Well, Alfred was in New York. How he'd been a journalist, I think, in Paris, and then he came to help move the collections of the library from Amsterdam to London. I think it's this amazing interview where he describes meeting Alfred Wiener, and sort of as soon as he came out of the cab, having books sort of thrust into his hands, get to work, it's time. The urgency that Alfred Wiener had, this workaholic quality, that inspired the people that Alfred worked with.
Yeah, he gives Bondy like 2 or 3 huge packages without having almost exchanged a word with him, and says, right, get into the cab. So Bondy thought he was coming to an interview. He ends up in a cab with these 3 massive parcels. And Alfred said, I don't know how to use the post office. That was typical of his sort of impracticality. So you're going to have to come with me. And Bondy says, the extraordinary thing about this amazing encounter is that I felt no resentment at all, but felt pure pleasure at being drawn so quickly into the confidence of this delightful man. So he was obviously very charismatic.
Question towards the back.
Hello. Thank you, Lord Finkelstein, for the book. It brings, for those of us who have become involved with the library more recently, it brings it really to life in a really powerful way, and I really enjoyed reading it. My question is to do with the Frank sisters, and there's interactions throughout the book with the Frank sisters, and I wondered, in your family and in your conversations with your mother and maybe others, was it a point of pride, a point of fact? What was the kind of relationship there? Because I didn't quite understand.
Yeah, so one of the things that I was used to do, I was used to seeing, is Anne Frank described as a young Dutch girl, right? You'll have heard that. But in fact, like my mother, she was born in Germany. And in fact, my mother was only in Germany when she was a baby, but Anne Frank was there actually when she was a child, a small child, admittedly. And the Franks were, in exactly the same way, German refugees in Holland, and there was a German refugee community, and Otto Frank actually established the synagogue that my mother and her sisters and Greta and Alfred all went to, the Liberal synagogue. And Ruth and Margot were both very studious and particularly interested in learning about Hebrew, actually, both of them. And they were roughly the same age, so they were in the same class, whereas my mother was was younger than that. But I do remember that when Justin Bieber went to the Anne Frank house, and he writes in the guest book, Anne was a great girl. I hope she would have been a believer. Right? Now, this one, which is the name for his family, and everybody attacks him as being crass. And I told my mother this story, and instead of saying, God, that's so crass, she said, yeah, I suspect she would have been. And what she was trying to establish there, which is very important in understanding Anne Frank, and I hope that, you know, what little there is about Anne and Margot in the book inspires this thought. To them, she wasn't a famous person. She was just a girl, and a girl in the class, as Ruth put it. And she would have been, you know, she had movie stars on her wall in the Anne Frank house. She turned out to have this incredible, precocious literary talent, which actually nobody else appreciated, and which obviously came out in this extraordinary way in the diaries, and Ruth described herself as being amazed by it when they saw it. So the perspective on Anne and Margot Frank that I hope the book brings is that the perspective of contemporaries was that they were just girls, and that is the whole point of Anne Frank. It's not that she is which is what's become the case, a kind of symbol and an icon. She was just a girl. That's the whole point of that story. And that this person who was just a girl had to suffer in this way because she was just a girl and a Jewish girl. And so I hope it will make the Anne Frank story more understandable. So in terms of my mother, because Ruth had known her better, but also because of the way that my mother was, she wouldn't want to lean very heavily on the idea that she was some great friend of Anne Frank's, which wasn't true anyway. But they certainly were part of the same community and had very similar experiences. And Otto and Alfred were good friends after the war, and had been a bit before as well.
Could I just take the opportunity to thank Pierre for his question? Pierre is actually the chair of our US Friends branch, and the library has these strong historic connections with the United States, and there is an opportunity for citizens of the United States to support the library, and it's something that's really needed. The library is a charitable institution, and we can't do this important work without your support. So please do follow our social media. We actually have a live fundraiser going at the moment, which will match any donations that come to the library. And we also have details on our website if you want to donate through US Friends, which allows people to take advantage of a 501c3, which we have. So I do appeal to you to support the important work of the library if you can. Thank you.
That wasn't the reason for my question.
No.
Alfred would have liked that as a reason. He spent a lot of the time after, actually all the way through his career, supporting the library was actually an important part of his anti-Nazi resistance work. That simple act of keeping the library going and making sure that he preserved his work. And I talked about him coming to Debórah, about him coming back to London to do that. He thought, and I think he was right, that it was a vital resource.
And I think one of my favourite Alfred Wiener quotes is the idea that the library is kind of an annually recurring miracle. And there's been many times when it could have been lost to all of us. Pretty much every year, actually, in the 90 years since it started. It's got a bit easier, I can attest to that, but still, we do need your help. So do we have any other questions?
Toby, maybe we could take a couple from online.
Yeah, sure.
And then you can, in the room, rack your brain, see if you can think up a good closing question. We'll take a couple from online first, though. So first, from a name that will be familiar to many, David Zelenziger asks, or at least the last name, who told you that Kurt Zelenziger didn't want the remaining Amsterdam staff to leave. My father said all 3 had Ecuador passports and were ready to leave until the invasion prevented it.
Yeah, I'm aware there are just, I mean, as I include in the book, that accounts vary about that incident, and I do credit for that in the book and say that and I can't settle that. If he can't and Bethlehem can't, I can't. All I can do is record the fact that they disputed it and felt a difference of opinion on that, and I can't say beyond that. And by the way, that's what I try and do in the book the whole way, is just to say what the record shows, and if there's a dispute over some aspect or some fact or some part of the story, I include that too, and readers can make out for themselves what they feel.
So here's another question from Susan Berkson. Please tell us how your mother reacted to her mother Greta's death, and how Greta's death affected the sisters immediately after the war.
Sure. So I think my mother was very young throughout all of these events, and I think she felt later in her life what added to her sense of loss was the feeling that she didn't really know her mother in the way that you get to know them when you're a bit older. That, I think, was a big tragedy for her, and she was sort of rendered numb. At the time, all the girls recall this sort of fact that they're arriving across the border to Switzerland. They have finally made their way to freedom. Greta has seen them through everything. She has starved herself to feed the children. And as they cross into Switzerland, on that first evening, she dies. And I think that was very difficult for any of the children to process, particularly at the time when so much else was going on. They were gaining their freedom, and it took them all years, I think, to come to terms with it. So I think it was always a hole for my mother, actually, and she did talk about that later in her life, really. When she was dying herself, really, she talked about it a bit, and how young her mother had been. You know, she wasn't 50 when she died.
We probably have time to squeeze in one last question from the room, if there is. Yeah.
How did your parents meet?
That's a good question. So both of them came to London in 1947, completely differently. They obviously didn't know each other. Their stories, by the way, do very lightly touch, because the man Alexander Wadoszów, the Polish diplomat who obtains the passports for them, had actually gone to school in the same school as my paternal grandfather. So there's like a little crossover in their stories. But they went to B'nai B'rith in Seymour Place near Marble Arch. My mother was the secretary of the group. My father was coming to his first meeting, and they met there. And my father took my mother on a first date to an Institute of Physics exhibition. And I laughed at that, always, and it was always like a family joke that he'd done that. But I realized when I was writing this that the rest of us laughed, but my mother didn't think it was particularly funny. She didn't think it wasn't funny, she just thought it was a perfectly ordinary place to be taken on a date, because she was the daughter of Alfred Wiener, who was an intellectual of the same kind. And my father was very heavily influenced by Alfred, and many of the things that he took up later in his life. For example, Alfred wanted to be a rabbi, and my father felt that too. And that my father ended up thinking towards the end of his life maybe he should become a rabbi, and he also didn't. But they've picked up the same intellectual interests.
So before I make a couple of closing comments, Debórah, do you have any thoughts that or any last questions? Because you had so many brilliant ones.
No, I think between us, between the audience, the virtual audience, and us, we have done a wonderful job of introducing this wonderful, wonderful memoir, Two Roads Home.
Thank you so much, both of you. And also thank you to the audience both here and online for joining us. For those here, we are going to have a reception event which will take place just upstairs, and we will also have a book signing where Daniel will be signing books just upstairs where the reception is also taking place. So I'd like to invite everyone in the room to join us there. But for everyone, I'd just like to say one last time, thank you for joining us. Thank you, that was wonderful.
David wants to do a photograph. Rian, could we have